Good afternoon, Miss Miller.
Good afternoon.
So we're just gonna go ahead and debrief about the lesson that I had an opportunity to observe.
Okay.
Where you were doing speed discussions with your students that engaged them in the academic discussion.
Okay.
Standpoint. So I wanted to ask you, did you have a time to reflect on the lesson?
Mhm.
All right. So can you go ahead and tell me about like what was your overall feeling? What did you do well?
I think for the first class that I did, I was hesitant with doing it, and I realized that I needed to model per se. So I ended up adding a video that showed them what speed dating was, just so they had the correlation. But overall,
Okay.
I think I did well.
Mhm.
Um, I did have to explain some of the same concepts over and over and over, but again, that's just my side for having done it for the first time. But overall, I think it went well.
Okay, so overall, it went really. What do you think? What did the students find as a highlight in that particular lesson?
That they were one of my DES students actually made the comment that he can't believe that he came up with some of his answers. So I think just having that discussion at a smaller scale was helpful because while some of the kids still struggled, the kids that could do the work and were willing to just push themselves outside of their limit were able to do so in a safer environment.
Okay, and that leads me into my next question. I think, how to what extent do you feel students were able to accomplish the goal or the objective for that particular lesson, which was them engaging in collaborative discussion using evidence to support their responses?
I think they did well. They cited from the text as well as conversations that we've had prior leading up. They cited bell ringer activities. I think they did really well.
Okay. What about the materials and the methods that you use for the lesson? Like, how do you feel about those things?
The Legos,
Mm-hmm.
those were problematic only because you put Legos in front of a kid, they're going to build. So I can't really fault them for that, but that was the issue, just keeping them on task using Legos for what they were intended for.
Okay. So how would you, when you think about this lesson next time or this activity next time, what are some things that you are willing to change or improve on to help the students?
First thing, in the beginning of the lesson, I need to pull the kids that I know didn't do the assignment for whatever reason, because that takes away from the kids that did it, so I can pair them up together and they can struggle together. Legos, definitely not going to use anything connectable. And then just being sure that I thoroughly model. So I did it a couple of times after the original, but I'll pull kids to use as a model because I think just seeing it and maybe working through a fake prompt just to kind of get them used to what I'm expecting.
Okay, and thinking about that, do you think were there any surprises that you had that was just like, I don't know? And how did you react to those surprises?
I did not really plan for odd numbers, and that really, it messed me up on my end, which then messed up everything because I literally was stuck trying to explain a remedy. So again, foresight on my part, and there were some questions that I knew they would struggle with, and I needed to make sure they had the opportunity to fully break down the question prior to discussion, because I gave them time, but knowing that they were going to struggle, I should have gave them additional support or had a conversation prior to really getting into it.
Okay, I like that. And based off, and I know you were remediating standard RI8, which is delineate an argument and evaluate the author's effectiveness of the argument. How do you think your students did with that particular standard? And did you see growth in their development?
I definitely saw growth because the text that we're reading is Survival Selfish. She gives a lot of short stories as her evidence, and I actually heard several kids make the comment that none of this is based in fact. So that's showing that they're now thinking about the relevancy and the validity of the textual evidence, which was the struggle point previously. As far as breaking down the components of the argument, they had that, they did that well, but just making sure they understood whether or not her evidence was good.
If you had to select one takeaway from this particular lesson, which was really great, like, so the things that I really enjoyed about the lesson was that every student had a part in it. It wasn't an opportunity for students to opt out. So when you walked in, every student was engaged in the process. They were answering the questions. They were going back to the text to support their answers. So it had a great pacing to it. And those are things that you do really, really well. Like, you pace your lessons with timers, with other materials. So what is that one takeaway from our conference, or that or your lesson that you want to maybe improve on, or something that you think you did really, really well on?
Improve on the modeling, because again, I can't expect them to do the task if they don't fully understand what I'm asking them to do.
Okay. And the thing that you did really well in this lesson?
Facilitate and not lead, because as I was walking around, when I did hear issues, instead of simply giving them the answer, I prompted them to find it on their own. all
right. So one of the things that you talked about is improvement on modeling. So maybe we could set up a time where we could go over activity that you're going to implement in your classroom, and show how we can model it for the students. So when you do present it in front of the students, you're prepared to handle those things. Is that something you'll be interested in?
Of course.
All right. Well,
also, wanted to make a note about the actual printing off the sheet.
Okay.
You know I hate copies,
Mm-hmm.
but that activity proved to me that my students appreciate copies. They were able to flip, all that. So that's another takeaway. I need to give them more hard copies.
All right. Is there any questions or concerns that you want to address with me?
No, ma'am.
All right. Well, thank you so much for allowing me to come into your classroom. It's always a pleasure. And I'm really excited to see how your students do the next time you implement this speed discussions in your class. All right? You're welcome.